My name is Bonnie Elliott and I'm a cinematographer. I didn't have the normal kind of, or the classic style start where people pick up a camera at the age of 5 and sort of become cinematographers by the time they're 10. My path was a bit slower to get to cinematography, and it was probably when I was studying at UTS straight after high school. I moved to Sydney from Adelaide, and I just wanted to do film in a sort of general sense. And cinematography was something that, yeah, I guess happened when I was on a film set for the first time, and I was boom swinging or something, and I watched the way everything seemed to be funneled through the camera on the set, and I was like, oh, I want to be over there where it sort of felt like the film was being made in the camera. I mean, starting at UTS was an interesting place because it's kind of one of the more, it was certainly when I went there, a more experimental place, I think, than say Afters, where I later studied. It was very much like, here, take a Bolex, here's an optical printer, let's show you the Cantrils, these amazing experimental filmmakers from the 70s, their 3-colour separations, go and try doing one. Like, it was quite loose, and I just was lucky because I was one of the few people who wanted to be a cinematographer in my year, so I got to shoot a lot of people's films, and this was on 16mm, and it was all being work printed so they could cut on Steenbeck, so it was quite an amazing grounding, I think, as a cinematographer, because I could see the mistakes I was making. If I underexposed, it was plainly, you know, like you could tell work print is totally unforgiving. But it was also really free, like I could just try things, like I'd try cross-processing, or I'd try there was like a rear filter slot in the Bolex, and you could just get your gel swatch pack from Lee and just cut a little bit and go, I'm gonna put a bit of green in, or, you know, just be crazy really. And I don't know, I think that for me was just a really important time for falling in love with the possibilities of image making and not being afraid to just go far away from what is normal good lighting, or just trying things. And I think for me that set me off in I guess a good direction in my own work of not being afraid to be bold, I suppose. But I did do a lot of work in a traditional sense, like as an assistant. So I did the kind of path of doing, I did a camera attachment on Heartbreak High, and got up early and made people coffee, and, you know, all that stuff you do early on. And then I worked as a loader, and I worked as a focus puller. So I did about 7 years of assisting, shooting all the time, but yeah, kind of really seeing how other people worked, which is important, I think. I think people really underestimate that. Lots of great DOPs have not assisted, but I also think you learn so much seeing other people do things. So yeah, and then I went to Afters and did the masters there, and that was good in a different way in terms of being more like a kind of finishing school, or something that really focuses you synthesize everything you've seen other people doing, your own work, and you just suddenly, you know, it kind of comes into a space of, you know, I think I felt I got my voice more clearly as a cinematographer during those 2 years there, where I really, you know, you're just really concentrating on what you're doing and no distractions of outside work. And yeah, so and then I've been shooting since then. I've had some good breaks, like I met a great director at film school. She was an editing student, she was an Iranian poet, and she disappeared after a year, and then I got a call from her and she said, oh, you know, I'm making this film about the lives of young people in Tehran and artists, and, you know, do you want to come and help me make this film? And I was like, that sounds amazing, but I never thought that film would ever happen. And somehow, you know, Adelaide Film Festival and South Australian Film Commission put money into this thing, and it was quite low budget, probably, you know, under $1 million. So they decided that they would take a risk on some young people and not have DOPs who had done 20 feature films, like someone new. So it was good for me because I got my first break as a cinematographer on a feature film not too long after film school, which that can be very hard, that first feature kind of credit. And that was a really extraordinary project. I went to Iran. I was embedded basically with an Iranian film crew. I was the only Australian on the set because the director was Iranian, she spoke Farsi. So I had this great experience of being immersed in another world of filmmaking and telling a story that was kind of a risky story to tell in some ways. And I look back now and I think, gee, we were very bold to go and make that film actually, because it was, you know, maybe not a film that the Iranian government was so excited was being made. That was a pretty standout project for me. I guess it was one of those films where it crystallised some idea of telling stories that are important, to me, and and being prepared to go the distance to tell those stories and put yourself out in the world in a way that's maybe, yeah, it can be a little risky, but the film is something I'm really proud of, and I think it speaks to a really truthful experience of life for young Iranians, which hopefully will change one day. I was drawn to shooting these final hours. I mean, I'd worked with Zach before, but the story of the end of the world, but told in a way that's about humanity's reaction and not so much about special effects and kind of Hollywood-style versions of that, was something that interested me. I thought this is kind of something I can relate to and find a way in with. And it's funny, actually, speaking of all those old UTS films, because some of the ideas about how it might look kind of go back to some of those things I played around with back then. And at UTS I did some stuff with bleach bypassing and chocolate filters on camera. And I kind of, for some reason, just, Zach was very clear from the outset. He's like, I want it to start yellow, and then I want it to be orange, and then I want it to be red. And that's the journey of the film, which, is a kind of very bold idea to start off with. And you don't often get a director who's that committed to something that extreme from the outset. So that was exciting, because he was not wanting to do something safe. But I had to then, I guess, translate that into something that would look okay on actors' skin tones. I mean, these are strong colours, and, there was, a process of trying to think about how we're going to make that work for the actors. And so I then thought about these filters I'd used. And we tested chocolate, but it wasn't quite the right one. We tested a whole bunch of glass filters. We tested antique suede, tobacco. What else did we test? There was a few different warm filters that we tested. And in the end, we really liked these two filters, antique suede and tobacco. And so, yeah, we decided to go with this bold idea of committing to some in-camera filtering, which is pretty unpopular these days, unfashionable, I would say. People are wanting to do it all in post. And I mean, yes, you can, but for me, it always feels like a kind of layer of grading across the image, whereas when you have it in the camera, it somehow interacts with the highlights and the midtones and the shadows in a more organic way. And I just felt like we're definitely going to go somewhere in the grade. What is the point of doing everything later and having to, I guess, really do too much work and really manipulate the image too hard in post? So I wanted to feel real. I wanted to feel that sweaty heat of that day and make the audience feel it too. And I just thought, well, let's just go there. And Zach, to his credit, was really up for that. So we did a bit in camera, and then of course took it even further in the grade, especially in the really crazy red end of the world kind of section, which, yeah, I don't think I'll ever get to grade anything that looks like that again. It's pretty funny. Zach and I had worked together on this short film, Transmission, which was sort of, the film was funded through this program, Springboard, and it was a kind of prelude to the movie, These Final Hours. So we'd already started to explore ideas of coverage together in that film, but we wanted to push things further and more, I guess you would say, into a more kinetic space for These Final Hours. So we were pretty clear that the film would be quite a handheld film. It became a mix of handheld and Steadicam, because we didn't want it to just feel like this default setting of everything is handheld and shaky, and we wanted some periods to have a kind of more eerie quality. I don't know if you've ever seen Elephant, that Gus Van Sant film, but that was a big inspiration for me in terms of the way we might use Steadicam to have this sort of sense of foreboding. So we plotted that out quite carefully. There was a lot of talk. Zach and I are very much into preparation. When you've only got 5 weeks to shoot such an ambitious film, I think you have to be really prepared to go through the detail of prep. And so we had a very clear shot list of the whole film, pretty much before we started official pre-production, which is kind of unusual. We spent quite a bit of time before that started. And then once we started getting locations, we started adapting our plan to fit these particular locations. And, obviously things change as they go along, but I would say that it is close to what we set out in our shot list. We did really conceive of this idea and that idea, and we did execute them, close to what we had planned. There's always a truth to that. You can tell a story on any camera, and it shouldn't be about having the fanciest camera in the world just for the sake of it. But I'm glad we didn't have to shoot on a 5D or an iPhone. I think the Alexa, I guess having come from a film background and starting in film, I'm really aware of how much ARRI have developed a sensor that responds to light more like film. It's always my first choice if I can have it in a digital context. I think the red is a good camera, and I have shot with the red, but I felt for this, because we were doing so much day exterior, I mean the whole film is day, I mean there's no night at all, so it just seemed a natural choice to have the Alexa. And it's also really ergonomic for handheld. I mean it's not a light camera, but it certainly sits on your shoulder well, and yeah, so there was a few reasons for it. For this film it was a set of ultra primes, which are a little bit sharper, Zeiss ultra primes. I've done a lot of stuff with super speeds, which are like, you know, a little bit older and a little bit slightly softer, but I felt for this film a little bit more crispness was a good thing. It's not a pretty film, it's not a film that romanticises things, and I thought the ultra primes fit with that quite well. They're also a nice weight for handheld and Steadicam work. They're not, you know, master primes are really quite big and heavy, so yeah, that's why we went with the ultra primes. I worked with a gaffer in Perth who was, I suppose, you know, an older generation gaffer, and it was really interesting to work with him because his approach to the size of fixtures was really different to what I'd been used to, you know, coming from, I guess, the world of low budget filmmaking. You know, you'd always go, oh, just something that can run off house power 1.2 or 2.5, and he'd be like, no, it's a 6K, no, it's a 4K. So we really, it was good actually. We stepped up the sort of levels of light. I mean, we wanted this idea in the lighting that the sun is just getting so hot and so powerful. So we wanted this kind of really strong sense of that heat coming into spaces. So having those bigger fixtures, I think, really helped with that. It was quite a lot of preparation that went into how we coloured the light. We did a lot of testing in combination with the filters. We also tested a lot of different gels. So we had this kind of wheel of colour that went through the interiors. It started off in a kind of subtle straw sort of space, and then went through to things like one called dirty white, and then there was apricot, and then it went into golden amber. These quite strong and sort of more theatrical gels in a way. So putting those onto HMI fixtures to give the colour of the sunlight coming in quite a strong cast, which bled into the shadows. And sometimes that would interact with a filter, so I'd be shooting with an antique suede and then we'd have apricot on the gel outside. So you're getting some quite interesting mixes of colour, which I don't think you could create them in post very easily. Like they're just these subtle, weird, you know, reaction of the filter to the gel. And we also use quite a lot of smoke in some of the interiors to really help the sense of heat. And so there was a lot of testing that went on. I'm quite big on testing the ideas beforehand so that you're kind of really clear about what the direction is that you're headed into. So yeah, I felt like we achieved, you know, this kind of hot day, but also there was a desire for some darkness and some reprieve from, you know, being outside in so much broad, bright Perth sunlight all throughout the film. I felt we needed to find some darkness in the interiors and shadow, so sort of working for that idea as well with the lighting. Perth is an interesting place. I don't know if you've been there, but it is kind of harsh visually. It's not a place like Sydney where you go, oh, it's so beautiful. It's not an easy place visually. And because I was from over east, as they say, coming to work with this Perth director and Perth crew, I guess I had a fresh set of eyes on what Perth could be in the end of the world. And I thought that what was interesting about it was the sort of the blandness of the suburbia in certain areas, like the really stark McMansions that have come out of the money from the mining boom. And there's all this new, really new bland suburbia. So when Zach and I were driving around looking at locations, I was really drawn to those areas. And there's lots of freeways in Perth and you're just driving constantly. It's this big sprawl. And I would say to him, can we just go over to that hill of, you know, McMansions over there? I want to see what's over there. That looks amazing. So we kind of gravitated towards, I think in a way, the ugliest parts of Perth. Like there's Fremantle, which is quite pretty. We never shot in Fremantle. We found probably the blandest, plainest parts of Perth. And I guess I just wanted to embrace the ugliness. I don't think that the film is a polite film about, you know, human beings and how great they are, and the way that it's a complicated film about how people react to this urgent sense of their own mortality. And I think that the harshness of Perth and that blandness, that bland melancholy, I guess I would call it, was a really interesting thing to look at, and a new take on what you might see at the end of the world. I mean, I did a lot of visual research before the film and trying to come to terms with what is it, how are we going to do the end of the world with this small budget, and what is that going to mean? And I looked at a lot of photojournalism, which is, you know, often in war zones and quite extreme places. And that was kind of interesting just to get a sense of people and, you know, chaos. But then it was like trying to think of that in this kind of melancholy suburbia, and how does that fit? And I found these amazing images of Hurricane Katrina. There was one photographer who'd gone around in the aftermath and photographed houses with messages on the walls, you know, so this kind of, and there's a few moments in the film where we've sort of taken that idea and put it there and put it into the film. But there was a sort of sadness and a kind of, yeah, there was something not so cliched, I guess, about what we were trying to do. I think we haven't seen the end of the world in the suburbs, and that's what we were going for. But going back to your question about light, Perth does have really sharp light. It doesn't get much cloud cover. It's really reliable, which is helpful for lighting continuity when you're doing a film all over one day, but shot over 25 or whatever it is days. So I was grateful to its consistency, but the harshness, I thought at first, I'm like, wow. And then I went, we're never ever going to be in a place where we can shoot this film in, you know, the beautiful light of the end of the day. This has to be a film where we just embrace the harshness, just go with it. It's actually good. And I sort of really, yeah, I enjoyed in the end going, yes, the middle of the day and that belting sun. And I probably, you know, in exposure would err on overexposing a little bit in camera, not so that we'd lose information, but just pushing things to sit in a sort of higher place in terms of exposure. And yeah, so then taking that harshness and looking at the interiors, yeah, the sources were, you know, like I said, these bigger lights, 6Ks and so forth, and they were a bit harder. I mean, there was some diffusion, but just to get that sense of this glare of sunlight and heat and oppressiveness coming in, it wasn't all, yeah, beautiful, soft sources that are kind of, yeah, more fashionable at the moment in cinematography. So, yeah, it was something different. I haven't used such big, harsh sources before, but for the story, it was the right choice, I think. Yeah, I mean, it's always weird watching your own work. There's always things you wish, oh, maybe it just, you know. But no, look, I'm really happy with what we achieved. I think that the ideas come across strongly visually, and I think it is a film that kind of takes you on a journey and really rockets along and has a real, you know, engine to it. And I think that is something I'm really proud of, that it has this kind of kinetic intensity to it. But then stillness as well, you know, because there are quite a lot of talky scenes, you know, between two people just in a room, you know, yeah, having their feelings, I guess, about what's going on. So it's an unusual film, I think. It's not a cliche version of just action all the way, but I do think it has a lot of propulsion through it, which is a good thing.